Hello, I'm Lindsey Bavin, Museum Curator at Truesyard Fisherfolk Museum in Kings Lynn. Now, first, thank you for watching. This talk was originally researched and presented by former RAF Air Traffic Controller Chris Pope as part of the museum's Trues Talk series in 2016. Sadly, Chris passed away in 2019, but he gifted his research to Truesyard and 4 aviation talks covering the history of aviation from its advent to the 100th anniversary of RAF Marham, where Chris was stationed for the last 6 years of his 22-year career in the RAF. His wife Mandy and daughter Madeline have given me permission to continue to give this talk in his honour. Right, so let's see if this technology will play ball. Okay, so far so good. Right, so I'm dealing with around a 30-mile radius in and around Kings Lynn. So we already know that from around 356 bases at the end of World War I, there was a dramatic decrease in the number of airfields in Britain, so that by 1924 only 27 military ones were left in the entire country. Generally, unless an airfield were kept on strength, as Bertram Newton was, they did not leave much of a mark on the landscape. After World War I, many were ploughed up and returned to agriculture, including the great government aerodrome at Narborough, the country's largest fixed-wing airfield during the Great War, or were abandoned and disappeared for other reasons, including being built on. As the world marched stolidly towards a Second World War, however, some of the abandoned airfields were resurrected in one form or another, in some cases as decoy airfields, and some others which had survived the cull at the end of World War I were built up. And new airfields were also created, both between the wars, but much more significantly in the early years of World War II. One example of a between the wars creation was RAF Practice Camp, Sutton Bridge. As early as 1926, the Air Ministry had established this airfield for use as a gunnery training camp. This station operated both ground and towed target for live practice, machine gun fire and bomb dropping by aircraft. Originally, Sutton Bridge was set up for bomber crews, but during the Battle of Britain, it became apparent that whilst fighter pilots had acquired essential flying skills, they had received little or no training in aerial gunnery. Quite obviously, this was a serious deficiency for inexperienced pilots, as it meant things like the art of deflection shooting had largely to be picked up during operations, resulting in far fewer combat successes. For this reason, and after repeated approaches to senior officers, the fighter ace, Wing Commander Sailor Madeline, finally received authority to set up a fighter wing. Sailor Madeline was a respected leader and a high-scoring fighter pilot, whose 10 rules for air fighting were already on many fighter squadrons' notice boards. The South African Wing Commander fighter ace gained his sailor nickname from his pre-war career in the Merchant Marines, and wisely continued to be referred to by his nickname during the Second World War, when his given name of Adolf wasn't too popular in Britain. The Central Gunnery School operated from Sutton Bridge from the 1st of April 1942, with its new wider remit including fighter training, and remained until February 1944. It shows how important Sutton Bridge was, and as RAF station in that numbered 266 Squadron took delivery of Supermarine Spitfires there in January 1940, thus becoming only the RAF's second Spitfire fighter squadron ever. On inception, Sutton Bridge had trained pilots of both the RAF and the Fleet Air Arm on biplanes such as you can see on the screen, and these ones as well. Now, many distinguished Second World War combat pilots passed through RAF Sutton Bridge, including a young airman who would later become Group Captain Sir Douglas Bader and Dam Busters lecturer Guy Gibson. During the early part of 1943, Sutton Bridge was used to practice the low-level flying needed for Operation Just Ice, the legendary Dam Busters raid. Sergeant Johnny Johnson, DFM, bomber aimer, and on board Lancaster bomber AJT, commanded by Joe McCarthy, that attacked the Thorpe Dam from a height of just 30 feet, recounts that, approaching the village of Sutton Bridge, there were electric cables crossing the River Nene just before the bridge itself, and to hone their low level flying skills, they would regularly practice flying the Lancasters under the electric cables and then skim up over the cross-greased bridge, missing the bridge itself by just a few feet each time. Looking at a modern aeronautical map of the area, electricity cables ran just over 1¼ miles upstream of the bridge and at a height of just 240 and 250 feet. To fly a Lancaster under these wires and then less than a mile and a half later over the bridge takes some pretty astounding flying skills. One of the Lancasters that returned safely from the dam's raid actually crashed near another RAF station on the Wash while practicing for a later raid on an Italian dam, which in the end never became an operational mission. Today, small remnants of RAF Sutton Bridge Airfield exist. After it was closed in 1958, its land was initially transferred to the Ministry of Agriculture to be used by the Potato Marketing Board as one of the UK's leading agriculture experiment stations. And this is spookily coincidental, because knowing that Sutton Bridge would be a juicy target for the Luftwaffe, the Air Ministry decided quite early in the war to build a dummy airfield close by to act as a decoy for German bombers. The decoy airfield for Sutton Bridge was built between Sutton Bridge and King's Lynn in the marshes near Terrington St Clement, close to Fern Farm. RAF Terrington St Clement was a Q site, one of the many decoy airfields set up during World War II, when 3 types of dummy or decoy airfield were set up to lure enemy bombers away from the real airfields. There were K sites, which were established to look like airfields during the day, Q sites, which were intended to act as nighttime lures, and KQ sites, which were fairly obviously a combination of both day and night decoys. During the first concentrated air raid in East Anglia in World War II, the Luftwaffe claimed they had destroyed RAF Marham, but they did in fact bomb the Terrington Q site decoy, and although there was little or no tactical damage, there was a large amount of bomb damage in the village, and as a result, women and children were moved to Tilney each night as the Terrington site continued to act as decoy for both Sutton Bridge and Marham airfields until 1945. And the reason I cite the coincidence between this and Sutton Bridge's post-RAF usage was originally related by a local lad, Ray Russell, who lived alongside the main road between King's Lynn and Sutton Bridge at the time. He relates that, as a youth during the Second World War, his home was almost 3 miles as the crow flies from Terrington Marsh, where a decoy aerodrome was set up. The decoy airfield was constructed on rich, fertile farmland, and despite the fact that the site included electric night landing lights and other lighting features which were adjustable to simulate different runway lighting systems, it remained perfectly possible for the area of the decoy airfield to continue to be cultivated, and in one particular year it was used for growing potatoes. As was customary at the time, the potatoes when harvested would be stored in clamps, often referred to as graves, at the edge of the field. The potatoes would be piled into heaps shaped like a giant Toblerone, usually several yards long and about 6 feet high at the apex, and covered with layers of straw and earth to keep out the winter frosts. Earth being dug around the sides of the graves, therefore leaving a trench in which rainwater would drain from the sloping sides of the clamps. In spring, the graves would be opened up, and in turn the potatoes would be riddled to get rid of any dried on earth and to grade them according to size, after which they would be placed into sacks, ready for marketing. On one winter evening, the decoy airfield was singled out for a particular heavy attack when, in addition to several high explosive bombs, a vast number of incendiary bombs were also dropped, a string of which pierced and ended a potato clamp. Ray Russell's father had been badly wounded by shrapnel in the First World War and reckoned that he had an old score to settle, and so took great delight in joining the Home Guard, where he became a sergeant machine gun instructor for a number of units as well as carrying out normal platoon duties. He was out on patrol in the general direction of Terrington Marsh on the night in question, and when he returned home he had a broad grin on his face. "We fooled old Jerry with the dummy aerodrome again last night," he said, "but this time his firebombs cooked 5 tons of spuds. So the locals who turned out to see what the fuss was about joined us, and we all had baked potatoes for supper." So that's the baked spud of the title catered for, and the decoys partially catered for. But the decoy airfields were scattered far and wide across the whole of the county, and some were even built where old First World War airfields had been or close by. As you can see here, and here, and here. Decoy airfields were not the only RAF stations that local folk knew little or nothing about. Some of the local RAF stations are scarcely remembered to this day. I suspect that very few customers of Arbuckle's on the A10 just south of Bexwell roundabout, or the pupils at Downham Market Academy, know that they are within a stone's throw of what was a substantial World War II bomber station. RAF Downham Market was famous for a number of things, including 2 of its aircrew having posthumously gained the Victoria Cross. It was also famed for using aircraft with developmental radar-guided rear gun turrets, and for the use of FIDO, a means of burning off fog to better facilitate landings and or takeoffs when foggy conditions existed. Downham Market or Bexwell Airfield and buildings were constructed in 1941 and 42 as a satellite station for RAF Marham and for the heavy Stirling bombers, for which the previous satellite station at Barton Bendish proved unsuitable. 218 Squadron was the first to arrive in August 1942, and they were initially involved in mine laying, switching to night bombing duties over Germany and northern Italy later in the war, and it was during one raid over Turin that Flight Sergeant Aaron became wounded by flak. Despite some fairly horrific injuries, he managed to get his aircraft and crew safely back home, though he died some little time afterwards. He was awarded the VC for his actions. In August 1944, squadron leader Bazalgette took off in a 635 Squadron Lancaster tasked with pathfinding and target-making rocket storage facilities in France. Now, during the raid, his aircraft was hit and set on fire, yet Bazalgette continued to execute the mission to mark the target accurately before the Lancaster crash landed and exploded, killing the crew. For heroically continuing his given mission, Bazalgette was posthumously awarded the VC for this action. The final phase was with the Mosquitoes of 608 Squadron, and they carried out a huge number of sorties over industrial targets in Germany until the end of the war. Horsa gliders were also stored at Bexwell for a time before they were needed for the D-Day landings in June 1944. The last ever bombing raid on enemy-held soil in Europe was made from Downham, when 16 Mosquitoes of 608 Squadron were tasked with destroying an assembly of troop ships in Kiel, suspected of being made ready for reinforcing enemy units in Norway. After that, the airfield launched a number of sorties in support of Operation Manna, the dropping of food to starving civilians in Holland, and after the ceasefire was declared official, the station was also involved in numerous repatriation flights for ex-POWs returning from German concentration camps. All flying ceased by August 1946, and the station was decommissioned in September of that year. Evidence of the airfields having largely disappeared, but there are some wonderful memorials both in Bexwell Church and outside, where a wooden plaque to the 2 Victoria Cross holders stands on a grass area just off the lane to the church. Now, there is no way I can possibly cover everything that the RAF, the USAF and others did aviation-wise in our area during the Second World War. By the end of the war, Norfolk had some 37 major military airfields and numerous subsidiaries, not to mention things like ranges, decoy airfields and ammunition dumps. Later wartime airfields were constructed with their buildings dispersed sometimes over quite some distance, and also bomb dumps were often concealed in nearby woodland. A new feature appearing in these new airfields was the control tower or watch office. Improvements in wireless technology in the 1930s led to flying control becoming more sophisticated and the watch office becoming increasingly important. In addition to the principal airfields, a new class of satellite aerodrome was introduced, where each parent field had one or more, usually 2, satellites. This was designed to increase the effective capacity of the parent station without the expense of another fully equipped aerodrome. Examples of this in our area include Bircham Newton, parent station, and its satellites Docking and Langham, and West Raynham, parent, with its satellites at Great Massingham and Sculthorpe. It's quite interesting to note that it wasn't at all unusual for these satellites to develop into more substantial airfields than their parent station as the war progressed, Sculthorpe being a classic example. Feltwell was home to No. 75 New Zealand Squadron, Royal Air Force, at one point in time, and its satellite Methwold housed 464 Squadron, RAF. The New Zealanders made a name for themselves, gaining a VC in a rather spectacular fashion. Returning from attack on Munster, Germany on the night of the 7th of July 1941, and while over the Zuiderzee, cannon shells from an attacking Messerschmitt enemy 110 struck the starboard wing of a Vickers Wellington Mark IC of 75 New Zealand Squadron. The shell damage marked with A on the photo. This caused a fire from a fractured fuel line which threatened to spread to the whole wing. Initial efforts by the crew to douse the flames failed, so Sergeant Ward, the co-pilot, volunteered to tackle the fire by climbing out onto the wing via the astro hatch marked B on the photo. With the help of his navigator, he climbed through the narrow opening and then put on his parachute. Although the bomber was flying at a reduced speed, the wind pressure must have been sufficient to make this extremely difficult operation. Anyone who has ever tried to put on a World War II parachute will know that it's a hard enough job in calm weather and standing on terra firma. Doing so on top of a stricken Wellington bomber flying over enemy-occupied Holland at night must have been a nightmare. By kicking and using the fire axe and on the end of an engine cover securing rope held by the navigator, Ward then made hand and foot holds, marked 1, 2, and 3 on the photo, to enable him to struggle the 3 feet down the wing and to then proceed a further yard or so to a position behind the engine, despite the slipstream from the propeller which nearly blew him off the wing. Lying in this precarious position, he smothered the fire in the wing fabric with the engine cover and then attempted to push the engine cover into the hole in the wing and onto the leaking pipe from which the fire had originated. As he let go of the cover, however, the fierce slipstream blew it out, and when he tried again, it was torn from his hands and lost. Although exhausted from this effort, he was able, with the navigator's assistance, to make a successful but perilous journey back into the aircraft. When the aircraft was nearly home, some petrol which had collected in the wing blazed up furiously, but died down quite suddenly. His courageous action earned him the Victoria Cross, but tragically, Sergeant Ward was shot down and killed while bombing Hamburg on the night of the 15th and 16th of September 1941 in another Wellington of the squadron. Before we leave Feltwell, let me just briefly mention another little-known yet highly valuable unit based at Feltwell during the war. The Royal Air Force had a number of bomb disposal units around the county, and one of these was 6219 Bomb Disposal Flight, based at Feltwell, and called upon to do sterling service almost constantly throughout the war and beyond. Bob Spaulding was a member of this little-known unit, and a story he relates shows that 6219 Flight didn't just operate at Feltwell and its immediate environs. He recalls how one day he was sent out to dig up 3 American 500-pound bombs at Attleborough. While digging the first bomb out and getting near it, he noticed 2 USAF officers arrive on foot. He claims that at the time he wasn't an expert on American Army ranks, but that he guessed that the taller of the 2 gentlemen was maybe a colonel. It turned out that it was a certain Colonel James Stewart, the CEO of the squadron, which had lost the bombs. Bob Spaulding reports that Stewart was no publicly seeking Hollywood actor, but a real airman who has done his flying training prior to becoming a film star, and in the course of a friendly chat, he informed Bob and his team that the faulty bomb gear on a Liberator had been the cause of the bombs leaving the aircraft prematurely on this occasion. Throughout his combat career, Stewart flew as lead pilot in B-24 Liberators. And so to Bodney, originally an Air Force satellite station for Watton, as can be seen from this slide. In the summer of 1943, however, Bodney was turned over to the USAF and was assigned Designation Station 141, becoming the headquarters and main operating airfield for the 352nd Fighter Group, one of the most highly decorated USAF fighter groups in World War II in the latter years of the war. The 352nd Group flew nearly 6,000 combat hours in 19 months and claimed 519 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, 287 on the ground, and produced 26 aerial aces for losses in combat of 118 aircraft. During its American occupancy of Bodney Field also had hard standing areas and extra taxiways, roads, etc. laid down in macadam and concrete, and accommodation facilities were improved, indeed so much that some of the accommodation is still in use today by the Army as part of Bodney Camp. Back in 1941, David Watson, a young New Zealander, was flying Blenheim bombers out of RAF Watton when, on one training flight over Norfolk, he spotted something on the ground which could have changed the course of history. On landing at Watton, he asked his acting flight commander, Peter Meston, to go up with him and see what he thought of the phenomena he thought he had spotted. What he and subsequently his flight commander thought they had seen on the ground were secret airstrips. Piles of lime had been laid out in straight lines with what appeared to be arrowheads, and they seemed to be indicating areas or strips of relatively flat land that could be used as airstrips, and, next to a good many of them, the men reported seeing barns, which had been painted a conspicuous bright red. Wing Commander Nesson is later recorded as having said, "We tried to make sense of what we had seen. These markings had to have been plotted from the air and in daylight, but by whom? There were only two options, ourselves as a day bomber unit, or the fighter boys. We knew nothing about them, and even a dim fighter pilot would have not needed such guidance." But why were these markings there, and who had built them? Was there an innocent explanation, or something far more sinister? Were they in fact some kind of secret airfields being prepared for a Nazi invasion? Given the fairly natural wartime concerns, the men reported their findings and suspicions to their superiors, and the next day all hell broke loose, and RAF Watton was swarming with members of the Secret Service branch. David and Peter were told not to talk to anyone, and neither of them did till about 60 years later. Interviewed in October 2016 on the BBC's Inside Out East programme, Peter Meston finally broke his silence about the incident and said he was convinced that what they spotted were secret German landing sites. Most of these strips were in the northeast of the county, with three being between Norwich and Yarmouth and another two lying within the triangle formed by Norwich, Fakenham and Overstrand near Cromer. But one was very much in our area of Spore. Unconfirmed reports at the time also claimed the airstrips had been built on farms owned by a Dutch company with pre-war connections to Germany, and historian Colin Wall backs this theory. He's written a book about RAF Watton, as reported as saying that further investigations were carried out, and the farms at all the sites were owned by the same property company whose directions were Dutch, with links to Nazi Germany. There were also rumours that chicken hutches at the locations were laid out in the shape of Nazi swastika. So, was it a true story, or just a good yarn? It is true that numerous red barns remained even to the day, but bright red is subject to more than a little personal interpretation. The red lead paint, which was commonly used to prevent metal going rusty, could be considered bright red by some people, especially when it's freshly applied, and in some lights and at some angles, especially from the air, even rust can look reddish as well. The notion that chicken hutch swastikas could be deliberately laid out is frankly very unlikely. Possibly they could have been aligned by accident, but few chicken farmers even today venture aloft to check whether or not their chicken coops spell out some kind of secret message from the air. And also the idea of deliberately laying the hutches out to form such an obvious symbol from the air would only to invite it being reported by Allied aviators who would be far more likely to be flying over the area in daylight than enemy planes at that stage of the war. So it is hardly surprising that not everyone is convinced by the story of the secret enemy landing strips, though there is perhaps another plausible explanation. During the war, the British government was under constant pressure to try to defend our air bases. One very successful plan was to trick German bombers into attacking dummy targets, and we've already seen how hundreds of decoy airstrips were laid out to draw German bombers away from the real thing. Perhaps this was another kind of attempt to fool the Luftwaffe into doing some radical aerial ploughing by releasing bombs on sugar beet fields. Sadly, despite the recent release of wartime papers, the conclusions of the investigation have not been released, so I suppose we'll just have to go on guessing. Continue our trip around the area, we moved north by northwest to Great Massingham, to an airfield which became home to the Royal Air Force 18 Squadron between September 1940 and April 41. One of 18 Squadron's most popular sorties occurred when one of the squadron's Blenheims flew over Saint-Omer, France, and dropped a cylindrical container by a parachute. The cylinder housed a spare right artificial leg for Wing Commander Douglas Bader, the fighting ace who had been shot down 10 days earlier. The Germans had guaranteed safe passage for this delivery, and they were none too pleased when the Blenheim peeled off from his leg delivery mission and joined other aircraft of the squadron and proceeded on to bomb a target in northern France. Not cricket, I suppose, but they say all's fair in love and war. I also have to admit taking a little license for this story, as by that time the squadron had in fact moved from Great Massingham to Alton and then to Horsham St Faith. But that is still just about within our area, the 30-mile radius of King's Lynn. And it's a good story to bring in as it features Norwich International Airport, which is what Horsham St Faith became. And it does let me get the spare leg type of the title into the talk. Now, at the end of World War II, Norfolk had some 37 major military airfields and numerous subsidiaries. You could hardly fling a cricket ball in any direction without it landing on some airfield or another. Quite a few airfields with concrete runways became in latter years part of that particular Norfolk enterprise, Bernard Matthew Limited, the runways forming the foundations for many rows of turkey sheds, and one example of this in our area is Langham. Bircham is also unique in most of its buildings survive, and as most of you are probably already aware, form part of the CITB. Still, other airfields or parts of them have been taken over by gliding clubs and private aero clubs. And that brings my talk to a close. May I again ask you to understand, with the huge amount of aviation related stuff that went on in this area during World War II, I couldn't possibly cover it all. This talk was very much intended as an overview, and I hope you enjoyed it.